wish everybody a Shana Tova and mention just a couple of public service announcements. Next week, we are going to have to begin at 5:15 instead of 5:30. There may be some publications that went out that said 5:30, but it's going to be 5:15, talking about Yonah and the tail of the whale and some interesting aspects about Yonah, I think. So I'll remind everybody who's on the WhatsApp group, if you're not on that, let me know that you want to be on it and I'll put you on it to give you a gentle reminder on the morning of the Shiur. Also, those of you who are in Israel, you are certainly welcome to join us on October 2nd for our 29th annual Tshuva seminar featuring Rabbi Effie Kleinberg, Rabbi Hanoch Teller, and the one and only Natan Sharansky. That's in Renana on Sunday morning, October 2nd. It's worth the drive. 2 of the 3 speakers are coming from Yerushalayim, so they think it's worth it. In any case, let's get started. Parshat Nitzavim. It's a short parsha. This year, it is not combined with Vayelech, although that's what normally happens prior to Rosh Hashanah. This is the last Shabbat of the year, so I think we picked a good and controversial subject to discuss today. Can we force our kids to be Jewish? The Pasuk, the Torah, makes a very fascinating statement. It says, and Moshe says, you're all standing here. This is a gathering of the entire nation prior to the death of Moshe. He's delivering this address on the very last day of his life, Zayin Adar. We know he was born and died on the same date. And he gathers everybody, young and old, rich and poor, famous and not so famous, to talk about in this last very moving moment, forging this connection with God. And he says this very interesting statement. I'm doing this for everybody who is present today before God. And I'm saying all this for the people who are not here. It doesn't mean, by the way, that they were in their tents oversleeping or playing hooky. It means the people who are not yet born. Moshe says this applies not only to you, but it applies to all future generations. So immediately the commentators ask, well, how can that be? How are you going to bind somebody from another generation way into the future with something that's said today? They're not there. They didn't agree. They signed nothing. So, okay, somebody mentioned, okay, we'll respond to that chat later. So the commentators talk about this and say, give a couple of examples. First of all, those people who convert to Judaism, they were not there in body, but their neshamot were present. It's also a pretty esoterical statement, but they're also counted because, in a sense, since God exists in the past, present, and future, he knows who's going to convert, and they're included as well. And even though they're not bodily present at the moment, their neshomot are there. And then there's the question of what about the children? Okay, this applies to the parents who sign on the deal, but what about the children who come later? And one of the commentators makes a statement that says, well, parents and children are like trees and their branches. So just as the potential of the branches are in the parent tree, so the parents are making a covenant that's going to be binding upon the children as well. Well, this is a difficult concept to understand. I think I've mentioned before my own idea. I don't know where I heard it. Nothing's really my own, but we get it from somewhere else, one way or the other. And I said it's the metaphor or the example I would use is that when a plane takes off and a pregnant woman is on board, if she gives birth to that child while the plane is en route, there's no getting off. Even though the child didn't buy a ticket, nevertheless, if that child were to grow up on the plane, so there was a little imaginary, but if the child grows up and says, hey, I never decided I wanted to go on this flight. That never asked me. I never said, but you're on the plane. You can't get off. In a sense, the plane takes off when the Jewish people accept the Torah, come into Israel. And once that plane takes off, it's not landing until we come to this final redemption, whatever that may be. And therefore, everybody who got on that plane and their offspring, they're on for the ride, and they can't simply parachute off. If they do, well, that's the end of them. But we always face this controversy when we as parents try to inculcate something into our children who logically can come and say, you signed on to that. I didn't sign on to it. Why do I have to follow your particular beliefs? Maybe those aren't my beliefs. And I think many of us have either heard this from our children, or maybe it's something that we know that at least they think about. And it's appropriate to think about it. What is it that binds us to our ancestors and binds our children or descendants to us? So that's what I want to talk a little bit about, the concept of being a nation united, not only in present tense, but throughout history, and how we can somehow expect to logically bind or commit our children to something that they didn't necessarily sign on. Well, and I think we can also understand their position, perhaps, because we believe that there are rewards and punishments in Judaism. And, if they didn't agree to it and they do something wrong, they're subject to punishment. So I think it's logical for them to say, you entered me into a situation that now, if I don't keep these commandments, some of them have very dire repercussions. I mean, if you don't keep Shabbat, even though today we don't have a Beit Din that executes people, theoretically, you are guilty of mita b'dei shamayim, death at the hands of heaven. And you can say, well, I didn't sign on to that. I didn't agree to that. It's a difficult issue to discuss. So, and by the way, that's one of the reasons why, and I'm not going to get into, we talked about this when we discussed conversion, even though there are opinions to be more lenient when converting a child, there certainly are opinions that say if you are adopting a child or converting a child and they are being raised in a non-observant home, what you're actually doing is you're putting that child in a perilous situation, because prior to becoming Jewish, there were no expectations or requirements for them to keep Shabbat, to keep kosher, etc. But once you now have entered them into the Jewish faith, now they're liable. And once they reach bar bat mitzvah age, they're going to be subject to, again, the rewards or the punishments. And therefore, in many circles, even though it seems more lenient to convert a child to Judaism, and indeed there are opinions that say that it is to the benefit of that child to be Jewish and to exit another religion and enter ours, there is still some worry about the fact that they're going to be subject to punishment that comes if they aren't learning about and then ultimately doing the mitzvot. So it's a complicated issue and it's not simple. But what I really want to talk about in the few minutes that we have, many of us, I think, I'm not going to venture a percentage, but a lot of families and parents deal with children who are either, let's say, unsure if they want to continue in the path that we've set out for them, that we follow, or that have left that path, what we call off the derech. And it's something that is not restricted to any one community. There are a lot of people who think, oh, well, it only happens in Israel. It doesn't happen outside of Israel, but it does. They think, well, it only happens in modern Orthodox families, but in Haredi families, no, it doesn't happen. That's wrong as well. Every community has it in one level or another. The only difference is that a more open community, like the modern Orthodox community, it's going to be more well-known. In a Haredi community, which is very sheltered and very closed off from society, you might not know about it, but the experts can tell you that it's happening there too, and in significant numbers. But families, of course, are going to keep it hidden because, as we say, it might shter the shidduch. And if somebody finds out that the member of the family is not observant, then it might spoil their shidduch when the time comes. And we know that there are families, and this is a very prevalent situation in the Haredi world. We personally know people that, unfortunately, one of the children was born special needs, Down syndrome, and the family either hides the fact or puts the child in an institution and never reveals that that's the child in order not to upset the possibility of a match, a shidduch that they want to have in the future. So it's there. And it's not unique to this generation for people thinking, oh, well, it only happens now. It's not true. Number one, you can go all the way back to Esav. Esav was Abraham's grandson, and he was Yitzchak's son. And you might say that Esav went off the derech. Why? His genes, his DNA were the same as Yaakov. They were twins. It happens. And even though there are some who try to fault Yitzchak and they say, well, you have to raise the child in line with his or her own personality. But I don't know that you can always blame the parent. They're lovely, wonderful, great families, and they care about their children, and it happens. They become distanced from Judaism. It happened to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a story that is not told all that publicly, but the fact is that Moshe had a grandson who was not only an idol worshiper, but he ran a temple for idol worshipers. And that's Moshe. There's a lot of stories about why that happened. One of the reasons given is that Moshe's father-in-law, you always can blame it on an in-law. Usually it's the mother-in-law, but in this case, the father-in-law is the one who told Moshe that I'm letting you marry my daughter Tzipporah on condition that one of your children will be able to test different religions like I did. And that's a dangerous proposition. In Korach's case, in Yitro's case, well, he discovered that Judaism was the best thing on the market, but it wasn't necessarily true for Moshe's grandson. You have other stories as well. The children of Shmuel Hanavi, they did not behave themselves. They did not conduct themselves properly, and therefore they were dismissed from helping in the Mishkan, in the Beit HaMikdash, because they went astray. So it happens, even to the best of families. So how do you deal with it? What can you possibly do? And I do not certainly have any snap or brilliant solutions. I'll just suggest what some of the approaches are. So one approach is to use that of fear, is to try to instill fear in our children that if they go astray, if they go off the derech, if they stop keeping mitzvot, Shabbat, kashrut, you name it, then something terrible will happen to them. And we try to scare the hell out of them. And if there's this very fascinating book that came out some years ago called Off the Derech, and it's case studies of children who, for one reason or another, left the path of observant Judaism. And there's some very horrendous stories in there about teachers, rabbis, even parents using all kinds of methods to scare the children into saying horrible things will happen to you if you don't keep the Torah. And indeed, we just read the Tochacha last week. And so there are sources to say, yeah, that's absolutely appropriate to tell them that look at all the things that can happen and instill fear. But just one of the stories that, and I actually brought to speak the author of that book, and one of the stories that she told us, was that in one case of a child, maybe in the third grade or fourth grade, that was questioning, why do I have to keep these laws? Why do I have to do mitzvot? So they turned off all the lights in the classroom till it was pitch dark. And the children had to sit in their seat. And then the teacher, the rabbi, would suddenly come up to this one child and pretend to start strangling him and saying, I am the evil spirit, and this is what will happen to you if you don't keep the mitzvot. In the middle of the night, I will come to you and I will strangle you. And obviously the kid was terrified. And this child grew up terrified and ultimately became non-religious and said that it was actually that incident which caused him to go away from Judaism and to say, I don't want to be part of such a religion. I don't want to live in fear and think that that's what's going to happen to me. So it had the opposite effect on him. So this is one approach that people use, and it's not uncommon to implement fear. The question is, how long is it going to hold? And will it be productive or counterproductive? If not now, later. And is this what we would call darchei noam? Is this the kind of approach to Judaism that we believe in? That we are doing all these things at some point because we're scared of what's going to happen to us. And this is certainly something we should think about before Rosh Hashanah. And we'll talk about this in a bit, about one of the tefillot of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that certainly has an element of fear in it. And maybe it is appropriate. And certainly there are some people who are trying to employ that to scare their children into staying on what we would consider the straight and narrow. A second approach, and this is what you see so much more so in Israel than you see outside of Israel, is to build walls so as to prevent anyone escaping from an atmosphere, environment, community of observant Judaism. So they will prevent any exposure to the world at large. It's not a real wall, but it's a very solid and actual wall that people will live in. Their phones are filtered, so they can't reach the outside world to hear about any ideas or any kind of pluralistic approach to Judaism. There's no TV. There essentially are no magazines. They cannot go to university. I quoted once this true story about a yeshiva where you could not attend if the parents owned a library card, not just a computer, but a library card, because books are dangerous. You read books, you'll get different ideas, and then maybe you'll think, well, I want to be like that. And therefore, to eliminate any of these forms of temptation, they build this wall. And in a sense, there's no escape from there, because if you do decide, I'm not going to follow these basic mitzvot, then you may very well be banished from that community. So you never escape, but you can be expelled. And in many of these cases, and unfortunately we know that it happens not just for religious observance, but also practicing Zionism, joining the army. And in Mea Shearim, males and females certainly, who are expelled from the community and ostracized because they decided to choose a different path than their community. And these people want to live within their community. And so those individuals that we would consider heroes, they would consider villains, and they would just be completely shut out of that community. Is that something that we can do? Can we live with that? Is that for anybody an approach to say, if you dare explore other avenues, then you'll just simply be ostracized? And we know a family where the husband and wife split up because they had a difference of opinion. One of the partners said, I will never have that child in my house because there'll be a bad influence on the other children, right? One bad apple can spoil the whole barrel. And the other person, you can guess whether that was the mother or the father, said, no, I'm not losing a child, and I will not forbid them to come home for Shabbat or to stay in the house. And the couple ended up divorcing over it. These are real life stories. And not to mention those who say and threaten children and say, if you leave Judaism, then you leave here and you will be cut out of the will. And there have been a lot of very interesting legal cases about being cut out of a will. Essentially, you cannot put in a will and that says this child will be deprived of any inheritance if they become non-observant. You can't do that. It's been tested legally, but you certainly can give away while you're alive whatever you want to whoever you want to. And sometimes that's the approach taken also as a form of inducement, if not punishment. And then there's a third approach besides fear and besides shutting people within a closed community, and that is love, acceptance. Not necessarily agreeing with children who decide to go their own way, off the derech, as we would say, but nevertheless not to shun them, but maybe even to increase the love that we have for them. And maybe that will eventually result in them coming back. It's not foolproof, but there are many stories like that. One of the stories on the subject, we once brought Rabbi Riskin. He should be well. He came to speak about this, and he spoke about a story in his own house where he's upstairs, the doorbell rings, and he's expecting somebody to come by who's, as you know, Rabbi Riskin, who has built this tremendous network of Torah schools, is very adept at fundraising. And he realized he had asked somebody to come over to his home. And before he could get downstairs, his son goes to answer the door, and he's can't get down fast enough because his son at the time had cut his hair into a mohawk. And you know what a mohawk is? You just got the one, whatever you want to call it, the one lane of hair in the middle of your head. And that's how he answered the door. And, you know, Rabbi Riskin had to make some explanations. But at the end of the day, he said, ultimately, he was a rebel, that child, and doing that as a way of attention, whatever it may be, and rebellion. But he said eventually, Baruch Hashem, every one of his children turned out to be observant. So if you show love, the doors open, they can come back. I would say that a kind of a corollary to this are really the two strategies of model and mazel. Be a role model, and ultimately we hope that every child deep down wants his or her parents' approval and to emulate them. There will be rebellion and there will be a testing of the borders, but we hope at some point children will realize that this is something which is, following in their parents' footsteps is not a bad thing. And we say, just like some people marry to marry their father or their mother, those kind of types. So children also deep down want their parents' approval. And if it doesn't come immediately, it will come at some point. I have to say, in a personal note, I'm very, very proud of my children, that each of them in their own way, beyond religious observance, they all volunteer in the community and do something to help soldiers, to help the poor, etc. And that's something which you can try to instill in a child, which brings tremendous pride. And you're willing to accept that, well, maybe they might not have the exact same religious, level of religious passion as you have, but there are other things that they'll do which will make them very, very, I'd say, beloved in God's eyes. So one way, I think, is to provide the example, and the other is you need mazel. You cannot put your finger and say with any kind of assurance that this person will stay religious or this person could stop being religious. I don't think anybody can predict that. And if the doors open and you don't isolate or exclude or ostracize that child, the hope is that they will come back. I have a good friend that he was really a hellraiser in his younger days. And and he did anything and everything that his parents would disapprove of. But the day his father died, he changed completely. And he became someone that his father would only be proud of, in the sense that he calmed down, he got a very good job, and he became religious. Today, he's extremely observant. And I think it was almost an immediate change when he realized, maybe I disappointed my father when he was alive, but I don't want to do it now. And there are a lot of stories like that. You build a child's self-esteem and you automatically lower their rebelliousness. You build them up and you tell them how valuable they are and how loved they are. They will be less, why would they rebel against that? It's music to their ears, but you do it with love. And I want to just, to close, we're going to read on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we're going to read this most famous of prayers called Untitled Chapter. It's a very controversial prayer. Without going to the whole story of Rabbi Amnon, did he really write it? What really happened to him when he supposedly said he would consider converting out of Judaism, and ultimately was tortured and killed. But we read this prayer, Untitled Chapter, and it has two very, very distinct approaches within it. The first approach is clearly one of love. And it says, and it compares God to a shepherd who cares about each and every one of his flock or her flock and knows each and every one individually. Kavakarat roa edro, they pass before him one by one, and he lovingly counts them and basically shows how much he cares about each and every one. That's love. But then we have the last part, which we all are familiar with. Mi yichya, mi yamut, who will live, who will die, mi ba'esh, mi ba'mayim, who by fire, who by water, who's going to be strangled, who's going to be stoned, who's going to be pierced by the sword, torn up by a beast, etc. That's a very different approach. That's fear. That's people thinking, I don't want to die. And if I die, I certainly don't want to die by, you name it, by being strangled or falling off a mountain. So both approaches are here. And that's what makes it such a controversial tefillah. But I suggest that what's happening there, when we're talking about doing tshuva, we're talking about coming closer to God. So this tefillah is putting out there both of the different approaches. But the first one is love. And that seems to me to be primary. And that's why it's put first, even though the other one is there too. So I guess you have to think about whether they're completely opposite to one another, or maybe you have a little of each. Maybe you can have an approach which on the one hand is somewhat stern and saying, we do believe in reward and punishment, and we do want the best for you, and we believe in God, and we believe that your actions are recorded and make a difference and have repercussions. But at the same time, we love you. And I think the combination is maybe the best. We end that tefillah, as you know, tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah ma'avir nitro hagzera. And these are different approaches as well, that if you have a situation with a child who is not doing what you feel is appropriate, you can and should pray. You should also yourself make sure you do tshuva so you're the right kind of role model. And tzedakah, be involved in the community. Doesn't have to be with money. People make a mistake and think tzedakah is all about money, but it's not. It can include money, but it's more giving of yourself and doing something for the community, showing your connection to your fellow Jew. And these are things that have an impact on children, even if they don't show it. Will it work? I don't know, but it's worth a try. And sometimes you just simply have to find the way to get through to your children and grandchildren. And hopefully, if you do it as sincerely as you can, Hashem will help you the rest of the way. And we will produce the offspring, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, some of whom we don't know. We don't really know about our great-great-grandchildren, who they'll be, what they'll be. But we can do our share so that maybe it will filter down. We have a promise of that. You can read in Pirkei Avot that the things that happen in the future are based upon what we did in the past. And it would be a zchut for us, and certainly would be something to think about for Rosh Hashanah. So I want to wish everybody success with our children, and that ultimately we should all live a rewarding life closer to Hashem, because that will bring meaning and that will bring satisfaction and truth and joy. And that Hashem gives us many opportunities for many years to pursue that and to do the work we need to do. So I wish you all Shana Tova. If somebody wants to make a comment for a minute or two, you can unmute yourself and do so. A reminder again, 5:15 next Thursday, 5:15 Israel time, 10:15 New York time. I think that's 10:12 Cleveland time. That's another story. And everybody, you should have a successful Rosh Hashanah, and your tefillot should be heard by Hashem.
Thank you, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, kulam.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you all.